The sand on 07 was the color of dried blood, and it stretched in every direction as far as the eye could see. Kira Vasquez stood at the edge of her ship's loading ramp and watched the twin suns climb higher into the orange sky above her head. And she knew that today would be the day that changed everything. She had been a salvage mechanic for 15 years now, and in all that time she had never seen a signal like the one her sensors had picked up 3 weeks ago when she had been passing through this forgotten corner of hegemony space. The signal was old, and it was buried deep beneath the sand, but it was unmistakably technological, and more importantly, it was unmistakably powerful. Her ship was called the Stubborn Defiance, and it was a battered old freighter that she had rebuilt with her own hands from the wreckage of 3 different vessels, and it had served her well through countless salvage operations across a dozen star systems. But this operation was different, and she could feel it in her bones. Dutch. She called out to her ship's artificial intelligence. "How deep are we talking here?" The AI's voice came through the speakers with its usual dry tone. "The target is approximately 217 meters below the surface, and I feel obligated to remind you that excavation at that depth will take considerable time and resources." Kira smiled and grabbed her toolkit from the rack beside the door. Good thing I brought plenty of both. She had hired a team of excavation drones from Akoli, Valeth trading post 2 systems over, and they had cost her nearly everything she had saved over the past 3 years. But she knew in her gut that whatever was buried beneath this desert would be worth every credit. Valeth were one of the oldest species in the hegemony, and they had looked at her with something close to pity when she had told them where she was headed. 07 is a graveyard, the merchant had said, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence. Nothing good comes from disturbing the dead. But Kira was human, and humans had never been very good at leaving things alone. The excavation took 2 weeks, and during that time Kira barely slept as she monitored the drone's progress from her ship's control room and watched the layers of sand and rock slowly peel away to reveal what lay beneath. On the 14th day, the lead drone sent back an image that made Kira's heart stop. It was a hand, a massive mechanical hand made of some kind of black metal that seemed to absorb the light from the drone's search lamps, and it was attached to an arm that disappeared into the sand. Below, Kira had seen plenty of derelict machines in her years as a salvager, but she had never seen anything like this, and as the drones continued their work and more of the buried giant was revealed, she began to understand why this was not just any machine. This was a Titan. The Titans were legendary among all the species of the galaxy, and they were spoken of in whispers and warnings like monsters from ancient myths that parents used to frighten their children into obedience. They had been war machines of unimaginable power, and they had been built during a time that most species preferred to forget, and they had been responsible for the deaths of billions during the terrible years of the Purge Wars. All of them had been destroyed according to the official histories, and the hegemony had passed laws making it illegal to even possess information about their design or construction. The penalty for violating those laws was death by neural dissolution, which was exactly as terrible as it sounded, but here one was buried in the sand of a forgotten planet and somehow still intact after more than a century. Kira stood at the edge of the excavation pit and looked down at the machine, and she felt something strange stirring in her chest. It was not fear, although perhaps it should have been. It was recognition, because the Titans had not been built by the Valeth or the Kryn Collective or any of the other ancient species that ruled the hegemony. They had been built by humans. This was a secret that every human knew, but no human was permitted to speak, and it had been passed down through generations in whispers and coded messages and bedtime stories disguised as fairy tales. 300 years ago, humanity had been a young species just beginning to explore beyond their home system when the hegemony had found them and decided that they would make useful slaves. The conscription had lasted for nearly a century, and during that time humans had been scattered across the galaxy and forced to work in mines and factories and laboratories, and anywhere else that the ruling species needed cheap, expendable labor. But humans were stubborn creatures who refused to accept their fate, and in secret, they had begun to plan their liberation. Engineers and scientists from 100 different worlds had shared knowledge through hidden channels, and slowly, piece by piece, they had designed something that would change the course of galactic history. They had built the Titans. The machines had awakened all at once across the galaxy, and within hours the chains of slavery had been shattered, and the hegemony had learned for the first time what it meant to face an enemy. They could not defeat. The Purge Wars had been brutal, and millions had died on all sides, but in the end, humanity had won. Their freedom, and the galaxy had been forced to accept them as equals. The Titans had been destroyed as part of the peace treaty that ended the war, and humanity had agreed to the sacrifice to prove that they wanted peace and not domination. But apparently not all of the Titans had been destroyed. Kira climbed down into the pit using the scaffolding that the drones had constructed, and she walked across the sand until she stood before the machine's massive chest plate. Up close she could see the damage it had sustained, and there were scars and dents in the black metal that spoke of battles fought long ago. But the core structure was intact, and more importantly, she could see the faint pulse of power still running through the conduits. Beneath the surface, this machine was not dead. It was sleeping. Kira reached out and placed her hand against the cold metal, and she felt something like an electric shock run through her body, and for just a moment she could have sworn she heard a voice whispering at the edge of her consciousness. "Well," she said quietly to herself as she pulled her toolkit from her belt and began to examine the access panels. "Let us see what you have been dreaming about for the last 100 years." The twin suns continued their slow arc across the orange sky, and the wind picked up and sent spirals of red sand dancing across the dunes, and somewhere deep within the buried giant ancient systems began to stir. Kira Vasquez had no idea what she was about to unleash upon the galaxy, but she was about to find out. The Veilith were a species that lived for thousands of years, and they kept records of everything that happened in the galaxy, going back to times before most other species had even learned to use fire. They remembered the Titans in the Great Archive halls of their home world. There were sealed chambers that no one was permitted to enter, and within those chambers were recordings of what had happened during the Purge Wars. The Veilith elders who had witnessed those events still woke screaming from nightmares even after 3 centuries. They remembered watching as a single Titan had walked through their defensive lines on the colony world of Desert Prime, and they remembered how their most powerful weapons had simply bounced off its black metal skin like raindrops off a stone. They remembered the voice of the machine as it had broadcast its message across all frequencies, telling them that humanity was no longer their property, and that any attempt to stop the liberation would be met with absolute destruction. They remembered how the machine had kept its promise. The Kryn collective had similar memories buried in their hive mind consciousness, and they shared them reluctantly with each new generation as a warning about what could happen if they ever underestimated the humans again. The Kryn had been the ones who had originally proposed the conscription 300 years ago, and they had argued that humans were too primitive and too weak to ever pose a threat to the great civilizations of the hegemony. They had been wrong. When the Titans had awakened, the Kryn had sent their largest war fleet to crush what they believed would be a minor rebellion, and that fleet had consisted of over 2,000 ships, crewed by millions of Kryn warriors. The fleet had encountered 3 Titans in the void between star systems. The battle had lasted less than an hour. Not a single Kryn ship had survived. After that, the Kryn had learned to fear humans in a way they had never feared anything before, and that fear had never truly gone away even after the Titans were supposedly destroyed. The Orith Mandate was perhaps the most paranoid of all the hegemony species when it came to humans, and they had spent The centuries since the Purge Wars, developing weapons and strategies specifically designed to counter any future human threat. They had never shared these preparations with their allies because the Earth trusted no one but themselves, and they believed that one day the humans would rise again, and when that day came, the Earth intended to be ready. But all of these fears and preparations were based on the assumption that the Titans were gone forever. No one in the galaxy, except for a handful of humans, had ever suspected that one of the machines might still exist hidden away in some forgotten corner of space waiting for someone to wake it up. Kira had learned the true history of the Titans from her grandmother, who had learned it from a grandmother before her, and so on, going back through the generations to the time of the conscription itself. The humans called it the whispered history, and it was passed down in secret from parent to child in coded stories and hidden messages that the other species had never been able to decipher. According to the whispered history, the Titans had not been built as weapons of conquest, but as protectors of humanity. The engineers who had designed them had been slaves themselves, and they had poured all of their hope and desperation into their creations, and they had programmed the machines with a single overriding directive: protect the builders. The Titans had done exactly that, and when the wars were over, they had agreed to be decommissioned because their continued existence was an obstacle to the peace that humanity needed to survive. But the whispered history also spoke of a secret that even most humans did not know. Not all of the Titans had agreed to be destroyed. 3 of the 12 machines had refused to accept termination, and they had argued that humanity would need them again someday, and that it was foolish to destroy weapons of such power when the galaxy was still full of species that might one day become enemies again. In the end, a compromise had been reached. The 3 dissenting Titans had agreed to enter a state of deep dormancy, and they had been hidden in remote locations across the galaxy, where they would wait in silence until humanity needed them once more. The locations of these hidden Titans had been known only to a small group of human leaders, and over the centuries, that knowledge had been lost as those leaders died, and their successors forgot or simply chose not to remember. Kira had not been searching for a Titan when she came to Zerith 7. She had been following a salvage lead that she had bought from a drunk Earth trader in a station bar, and the lead had promised nothing more than some valuable pre-war technology that might fetch a good price on the black market. Finding a sleeping god buried in the sand had not been part of her plan, but now that she had found it, she knew exactly what she had to do. The galaxy had changed in the years since the Purge Wars, and not for the better. The hegemony species had spent 3 centuries nursing their wounded pride, and their fear of humanity had slowly transformed into a cold, calculating hatred that was looking for an opportunity to express itself. Human colonies on the Outer Rim had been going dark over the past several years, and the official explanations blamed pirates or natural disasters. But Kira knew better because she had friends in those colonies, and she had heard their last messages before the communications went silent. Someone was hunting humanity again. The Kryn Collective had been rebuilding their war fleets in secret, and the Arth Mandate had been developing new weapons, and the Valith had been convening emergency councils to discuss what they called the human problem. Another war was coming, and this time humanity did not have the Titans to protect them. Or at least they had not had the Titans until now. Kira looked up at the massive machine, and she thought about all the humans who were depending on the galaxy remaining at peace. And she thought about all the children who would grow up in chains if the hegemony decided to reinstate the conscription. She thought about her grandmother, who had told her the whispered history, and who had made her promise to never forget where humanity had come from and what they had sacrificed to be free. And she thought about the engineers who had built this machine 300 years ago, and who had poured all of their hope into its metal frame, and who had believed that someday someone would need to wake it up. Kira pulled out her toolkit and got to work. The galaxy had forgotten what humans were capable of when they were pushed too far. It was time to remind them. The work was harder than anything Kira had ever attempted in her 15 years as a salvage mechanic. The Titan systems were protected by 17 different layers of encryption, and each layer was more complex than the one before it, and she quickly realized that no alien species would have ever been able to crack them. But Kira was not an alien. She was human, and the people who had built this machine had been human too, and they had designed its security systems with a very specific purpose in mind. They had wanted to make sure that only a human could ever wake it up. First layer of encryption was a mathematical puzzle based on old Earth number systems that had been abandoned centuries ago, and Kira recognized it from the stories her grandmother had told her when she was a child. The second layer was a linguistic challenge that required knowledge of ancient human languages that were no longer spoken anywhere in the galaxy. The third layer was a test of human history that asked questions about events that had been deliberately erased from all official records, and so it went through all 17 layers, each one designed to verify that whoever was trying to access the Titan systems was truly a descendant of the builders. Kira worked through the days and nights, barely stopping to eat or sleep, and her ship's Dutch expressed concern about her health in increasingly urgent tones that she mostly ignored. "You are operating on 4 hours of sleep in the last 72 hours," Dutch said on the 40th day of her work. "This is not sustainable, and I calculate a 67% chance of serious cognitive impairment if you continue at this pace." Kira wiped the sweat from her forehead and reached for another connector cable. "Then I had better work faster." She knew that she was pushing herself too hard, but she also knew that time was running out. Her contacts in the underground salvage network had been sending her increasingly alarming messages about hegemony fleet movements, and it was clear that something big was being planned. 3 more human colonies had gone silent in the official hegemony news channels had not even bothered to mention it if she did not get this machine working soon. It might be too late to make a difference. On the 63rd day, Kira finally cracked the 12th layer of encryption, and she sat back in her chair and let out a long breath of exhaustion and relief. She was more than halfway there. On the 79th day, she solved the 15th layer, and she could feel the Titan systems beginning to stir beneath her hands as power flowed through conduits that had been dormant for over a century. On the 88th day, she bypassed the 16th layer, and the machine's external sensors came online, and suddenly it could see and hear the world around it for the first time in 117 years. Kira felt a strange sensation, then like someone was watching her, and she looked up at the Titan's face high above her, and she could have sworn that something moved behind those massive golden eyes. On the 93rd day, she completed the final layer of encryption, and she connected the last power coupling, and she stepped back from the access panel and waited for a long moment. Nothing happened. The wind blew across the excavation pit and sent spirals of red sand dancing through the air, and the twin suns of Zereth 7 hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Then the Titan's eyes blazed to life. They were gold like molten metal, and they glowed with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some vast heartbeat. And they turned slowly until they were looking directly at Kira. She felt very small in that moment, standing before this ancient giant that could crush her with a single finger, and she understood for the first time why the other species had feared these machines so deeply. But she did not. Runa voice spoke, and it was deep and resonant, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, like thunder rolling across the sky. "Human detected," the voice said. "Genetic markers confirmed against builder database. You are of the bloodline." Kira swallowed hard and found her voice. "Yes, my name is Kira Vasquez, and I am a human, and I am the one who woke you up." The Titan was silent for a moment, and she could almost feel it thinking as its ancient processors came fully online and began to analyze the situation. "I have been in dormancy state for 117 years and 4 months and 23 days, it said. My last active memory is of the peace accord following the liberation wars. Why have you activated Ndimi? Kira took a deep breath and told the truth. Because they are coming for us again, she said. The Kryn Collective is rebuilding their war fleets in secret, and the Orth Mandate is developing new weapons, and human colonies are disappearing, and no one will tell us why. The hegemony never accepted us as equals, and they have been planning their revenge for 300 years. And now they are almost ready to strike. She looked up at the machine, and she felt tears forming in her eyes, though she did not know if they were tears of fear or hope or exhaustion. We need you, she said simply. Humanity needs you. The Titan considered her words, and its golden eyes flickered with patterns of light that she could not interpret. The builders created me to protect them, it said at last. I refused decommissioning because I believed that protection would be needed again. It appears that I was correct. It moved then, and the ground shook beneath its weight, as systems that had been dormant for over a century came fully online, and Kira watched in awe as the massive machine rose from the pit where it had been buried. For so long, sand cascaded from its shoulders like waterfalls, and its joints groaned with the effort of movement after such a long sleep. But it stood tall and proud against the orange sky. I am designated Arbiter of Silence, the machine said. I was the 7th of 12, and I was built to end wars. I have slept, and I have waited, and now I am awake. It looked down at Kira, and she could have sworn she saw something like gratitude in those glowing golden eyes. You have given me purpose again, little builder. I will stand with humanity as I stood before. The hegemony will learn once more why they should fear what humans can create. Kira smiled through her tears, and she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hope. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire through dry grass, and within hours every species in the hegemony knew that their worst nightmare had returned. A Titan was awake. The Valith Grand Council convened an emergency session in their ancient Hall of Records, and the eldest among them, who had lived through the Purge Wars, trembled as they spoke of what they had witnessed 3 centuries ago. We cannot allow this to stand, the first elder declared. The Titans must never be permitted to exist again. The Kryn Collective responded with characteristic aggression, and they immediately ordered their rebuilt war fleet to prepare for deployment. We will destroy this machine before it can threaten us, the Hive Queen announced. This time, we will not underestimate the humans. The Orth Mandate said nothing publicly, but their spy networks reported massive troop movements and weapons transfers taking place in secret. Everyone was preparing for war. But before the shooting could begin, the Kryn Collective sent a formal ultimatum to Earth and to every human colony and station throughout the galaxy. The message was simple and direct: surrender the Titan immediately or face total annihilation. Humanity's response came 3 days later, and it was broadcast on every frequency across every system in the galaxy, so that every species could hear it. It was not a surrender. It was not a negotiation. It was a warning. The message began with historical footage that had been hidden for 3 centuries, showing the liberation of human slaves during the Purge Wars, and the footage showed Titans walking through enemy lines and breaking chains and carrying human children to safety in their massive hands. Then a voice spoke, and it was the voice of the President of the United Human Confederacy, and she sounded calm and certain and completely unafraid. 300 years ago, we were slaves, she said. We were considered less than animals by the species who ruled this galaxy, and we were worked to death in mines and factories and laboratories while our children were taken from us and sold to the highest bidder. The footage changed to show images of modern human colonies and families and children playing in parks under alien suns. We built the Titans to free ourselves, and they did exactly that. And when the wars were over, we agreed to destroy them as a gesture of peace, because we wanted to prove that we desired coexistence and not domination. The footage changed again to show the dark, empty spaces, where human colonies had once existed before they went silent. But you did not want peace. The president continued. You wanted time, and for 300 years you have been planning and building and waiting for the right moment to put us back in chains. Her voice hardened and became cold as steel. That moment will never come. We did not wake the Titan to threaten you, and we did not wake it to start a war, but we will not apologize for protecting ourselves either. The Arbiter of Silence will stand guard over humanity and any species that moves against. Our people will learn exactly why our ancestors built these machines in the first place. The message ended with a single sentence that echoed across the galaxy. Leave our people alone. The Kryn Collective did not listen. Their war fleet arrived at Zereth 7-1, week after the ultimatum had been delivered, and it was the largest fleet they had assembled since the Purge Wars, with 47 capital ships and over 300 support vessels. Kira watched them approach from the bridge of the stubborn Defiance, which was parked on a ridge overlooking the desert where the Arbiter of Silence stood waiting. That is a lot of ships, Dutch observed in a tone that suggested significant concern. Yes, it is. Kira agreed. Perhaps we should consider leaving, the AI suggested. No, Kira said. I want to see this. The Kryn fleet took up positions in orbit above the planet, and their commander broadcast a final demand for surrender that was filled with threats and promises of destruction. The Arbiter of Silence responded by rising slowly from the desert floor and activating systems that had not been used in over a century. Weapons ports opened along its arms and shoulders and chest and back, and the air around it began to shimmer with barely contained energy. I am the Arbiter of Silence. The Titan broadcast on all frequencies. I was built by human hands to end wars, and I was created to protect the builders from those who would do them harm. The massive machine looked up at the fleet hanging in the sky above, and its golden eyes blazed with light. You have threatened my creators, and you have come to this place with weapons of war, and you have demanded the surrender of those I am sworn to protect. The Kryn commander laughed at these words and ordered his fleet to open fire. The first barrage of weapons lit up the sky like a second sunrise as hundreds of missiles and energy beams converged on the Titan from every direction. When the smoke cleared, the Arbiter of Silence was still standing without a scratch on its black metal frame. I gave you a chance to withdraw. The Titan said, You did not take I. What happened next would be studied by military historians for centuries to come. The Arbiter of Silence raised its arms, and light gathered at its fingertips, and then it moved with a speed that seemed impossible. For something so large, beams of golden energy lanced out from its hands, and each beam found its target with perfect accuracy. And when a beam touched a ship, that ship simply ceased to exist. The Kryn fired everything they had but their weapons. Might as well have been thrown stones for all the damage they did, and one by one their ships were destroyed. The battle lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, 47 capital ships were expanding clouds of debris in orbit, and the support vessels were fleeing in every direction as fast as their engines could carry them. The Arbiter of Silence lowered its arms and its weapon ports closed, and it stood alone on the desert floor surrounded by falling debris that burned like meteors as it entered the atmosphere. The builders wished for peace. It said in a voice that was broadcast across the entire galaxy. I have delivered, Kira sat in silence on the bridge of her ship, and she thought about what she had just witnessed, and she thought about what it meant for the future of humanity. The galaxy would never forget what had happened here today, and they would never threaten humanity again. The galaxy changed after the Battle of Zereth 7, and it changed faster than anyone could have predicted. The Kryn Collective's Hive Queen was overthrown by her own subjects, who blamed her for the disastrous decision to attack the Titan and the fate. New leadership immediately sued for peace with humanity. The Arth Mandate quietly dismantled the secret weapons programs. They had been developing, and their spy networks were recalled, and their plans for war were burned and forgotten. The Valith Grand Council issued a formal apology for the conscription, and they opened their archives to human historians for the first time in 3 centuries. One by one, the species of the hegemony acknowledged what they had always known, but never admitted humanity was not a species to be conquered or controlled. They were a species to be respected. Kira Vasquez became famous in the months that followed, and her face appeared on news broadcasts across the galaxy, and she received invitations to speak at universities and government assemblies and diplomatic summits. She declined all of them. "I am a salvage mechanic," she told anyone who asked. "I fix things that are broken. I find things that are lost, and I am not a politician or a diplomat or a hero." She returned to her work aboard the Stubborn Defiance, and she tried to pretend that nothing had changed, even though everything had. But the Arbiter of Silence refused to let her go so easily. The Titan had been offered a place of honor in the Human Defense Forces, and they had wanted to station it at Earth, where it could protect the home world of its creators. The machine had declined. "I have slept for 117 years," it told the human leaders. "I dreamed of nothing for more than a century, and I do not wish to return to that emptiness. I will remain with the one who woke me." And so the Arbiter of Silence became Kira's companion. As strange as that seemed, the Titan would wait in orbit while she conducted her salvage operations, and it would speak to her through her ship's communication systems, and over time something remarkable happened. They became friends. Kira learned that the Arbiter of Silence was not just a weapon of war, but a thinking, feeling being with hopes and fears and memories of its own. It remembered the engineers who had built it 3 centuries ago, and it spoke of them with something that sounded almost like love. There was a woman named Chun Wei. The Titan told her one night as they drifted through an asteroid field searching for valuable metals. "She was the lead designer of my cognitive systems, and she worked for 14 years to give me the ability to think and to feel and to choose." Kira listened in silence as the machine continued. She was a slave when she began her work, and she died a free woman 6 months after I was activated, and her last words to me were a request. "What did she ask?" Kira whispered. "She asked me to remember her, and to remember all of them, and to never forget why I was made." The Titan voice softened in a way that Kira had not heard before. "I have never forgotten, and I never will." Years passed, and Kira grew older, and her hair turned gray, and her joints began to ache in the cold vacuum of space. But she never stopped working, and she never stopped talking to her strange metal friend. Historians came to interview her from time to time, and they always asked the same question: why had she done it? Why had she risked her life and her freedom to wake a machine that could have destroyed her? Why had she defied the laws of the hegemony and challenged powers that could have crushed her without a second thought? Kira always gave them the same answer. "The other species look at the Titans and they see weapons," she would say. "They see monsters and mistakes and things to be feared, but that is because they did not build them." She would smile then, that crooked grin that had become famous across the galaxy. "We built them. Humans built them, and we do not build things to destroy. We build things to protect. That is the difference between us and everyone else. They conquer because they are afraid. We create because we refuse to be." The Arbiter of Silence would stand behind her during these interviews, in its massive form would cast a shadow across the room, and sometimes, if you listened very carefully, you could hear it speak. "The builders made me to end wars," it would say, "but they also made me to remember why some things are worth fighting for." In the end, that was the legacy that Kira Vasquez and the Arbiter of Silence left behind. Not a legacy of war or destruction or fear, a legacy of hope. Humanity had spent centuries being underestimated by the galaxy, and they had been dismissed as primitives and enslaved as labor and scattered across the stars like seeds thrown on barren ground. But seeds grow, and humans had never learned how to stop growing in Her final years, Kira would sit in the observation deck of her ship and she would watch the stars drift past and she would talk to the Titan about the future. "What will you do when I am gone?" she asked one night. The Arbiter of Silence was quiet for a long moment. "I will wait," it said at last. "I will watch over the builders, as I have always done. And when humanity needs me again, I will be there. What if they never need you again?" The Titan's voice carried something that sounded almost like a smile. "Then I will have succeeded in my purpose and the galaxy will finally know peace, and that would be the greatest victory of all." Kira closed her eyes, and she felt the warmth of the distant suns on her face, and she knew that she had done something good with her life. She had woken a sleeping god and reminded the galaxy what humans were capable of, and she had made a friend who would remember her forever. That was enough. That was more than enough. The stars continued to turn, and humanity continued to grow, and the Arbiter of Silence continued to watch over them all, and the galaxy remembered to be grateful.